What if Doctor Who enters Warhammer 40k? The TARDIS drifted through the stars, searching for beauty. Instead, it found hell. The ancient blue box tumbled through the void between galaxies, its temporal engines humming with curiosity, pulled towards something vast and terrible. The Doctor stood at the console, fingers dancing across crystalline controls, his face bright with that eternal optimism that had carried him through countless regenerations. He sensed wonder ahead, discovery, perhaps even hope. But the universe he was about to enter had forgotten what hope meant. It had been dead for 10,000 years, buried beneath mountains of corpses and prayers whispered to a rotting god. The moment the TARDIS breached the barrier, everything changed. Reality screamed. The immaterium tore open like a wound, and suddenly the ship was drowning in colors that had no names, in sounds that were also smells, in time that flowed backward and sideways and inside out. The Doctor grabbed the console as the floor became the ceiling. Through the monitors, he saw it, the warp, an ocean of madness where demons swam through the nightmares of the living, where every human emotion had curdled into something hungry and hateful. The TARDIS shuddered, its psychic shields straining against the weight of 1 trillion screaming souls, and somewhere, impossibly far away yet close enough to touch, something vast opened its eyes. On Holy Terra, 10,000 light-years distant, the God Emperor of mankind stirred upon his golden throne. For a fraction of a second, his eternal vigilance flickered towards something new, something old, a traveler outside the flow of causality. A blue box that shouldn't exist, carrying a man who refused to die, sailing through a universe built on graves. The Custodes standing guard felt it too, a ripple in the warp, an anomaly, not chaos, not Xenos, something else entirely. Why? Something that moved through time like breathing, that regenerated like a demon but felt different, clean, impossibly, dangerously clean. The Emperor's psychic presence pulsed once, a silent command that echoed through 1 billion astropaths. Find it. The Doctor finally stabilized the TARDIS, hands trembling against the console. He'd traveled through dimensional rifts before. He'd seen parallel universes, pocket dimensions, timelines where physics wept. But this was different. This wasn't just another universe. This was a scar. A cosmic wound that had been bleeding for so long it had learned to call the bleeding normal. He checked the sensors, his ancient eyes narrowing. 41,000 years into humanity's future, give or take a few centuries, the readings made no sense. Human population in the quadrillions, life expectancy averaging 38 years, technology that looked like it was worshipping itself, faith as a weapon, war as a prayer. And underneath it all, that horrible ocean of madness, pressing against every living mind, like water against a dam about to break. He should have left. Every instinct in his Time Lord biology screamed at him to dematerialize, to run, to find literally any other point in space and time. The TARDIS itself was whimpering, its semi-sentient systems recoiling from the psychic pressure outside. But the Doctor had never been good at running away from suffering, and he could feel it now, pouring through the sensors like radiation. Pain on a scale he'd never imagined. Entire worlds of people living in agony, working until they died, praying to gods that fed on their prayers, fighting wars that would never end because ending would mean admitting it had all been for nothing. Billions of children born into slavery, trillions of souls burning in the warp. A species that had become a meat grinder, feeding itself into the fire one generation at a time. The Doctor's hand hovered over the dematerialization switch. One flip, one moment, he could leave, should leave. This wasn't his universe, these weren't his people. He'd learned that lesson before, hadn't he? Some things couldn't be fixed. Some darkness was too deep, some wounds too old. But his hand wouldn't move. Because underneath all that horror, underneath the screaming and the dying and the endless grinding machinery of war, he could hear something else, something so faint it was almost imaginary. The sound of people who still laughed sometimes, still loved, still hoped, even when hope was heresy, still held their children close and whispered that maybe, somehow, tomorrow would be different. Before we descend deeper into this darkness, make sure you're subscribed. Because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about mercy in a merciless galaxy. The Doctor made his choice. He always made the same choice. The TARDIS materialized with its familiar grinding wheeze, landing somewhere in the lower hives of a planet whose name had been forgotten centuries ago, replaced by a number in some imperial census that nobody would ever read. The door opened. The Doctor stepped out, sonic screwdriver in hand, wearing that impossible smile, ready to help, ready to heal, ready to show them that kindness still mattered. But in a universe where mercy is heresy, where compassion is corruption, where the only prayer anyone remembers is the prayer for a quick death, what happens to a man who refuses to kill? What happens when the last optimist in existence walks into a galaxy that has spent 10,000 years proving that optimism is a lie? The Inquisition was already mobilizing. The demons were already laughing. And somewhere in the warp, something ancient and hungry was beginning to take notice of the lonely god who still believed in saving people. The Doctor took a breath of recycled air thick with chemical waste, looked up at skies choked with factory smoke, listened to the grinding of machinery that never stopped, the prayers broadcast on endless loop, the distant screams of punishments both earned and arbitrary, and he smiled anyway, because that's what he did. That's what he'd always done, even when it was stupid, even when it was hopeless, even when the universe itself was begging him to give up and let the darkness win. He couldn't help himself. After all these centuries, after all these regenerations, after watching civilizations rise and fall like waves on a cosmic shore, he still believed it would destroy him, but not yet. The hive world had no name worth remembering. Designation Sigma Rho 447, according to imperial records buried in archives nobody had accessed in 300 years. 70 billion people lived here, died here, were born here in darkness and expired in darkness, never seeing a sky that wasn't corroded metal and chemical fog. The Doctor walked through the lower levels, where the workers lived stacked like cargo, where children with radiation burns begged for water that wasn't poisonous, where the elderly were processed into corpse starch before they turned 40. His footsteps echoed on floors made from compressed human remains. Everything here was made from human remains. They'd run out of other materials centuries ago. He found them in Sector 93, sub-level Omega. Radiation workers. Their job was simple: crawl into reactor chambers that leaked poison, repair the machinery with their bare hands, then crawl out to die over the next few weeks. The Mechanicus had calculated it was more efficient than building proper shielding. Flesh was cheaper than metal. The Adeptus Administratum agreed. These workers were already catalogued as deceased in the Imperial Tithe records. Their deaths had been filed in triplicate before they'd even started dying. The Doctor knelt beside a girl who couldn't have been more than 15, her skin already peeling away in sheets, her eyes clouded with cataracts. She was praying, whispering the same words over and over. "The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects." "Let me help you," the Doctor said softly, reaching for his sonic screwdriver. The device hummed to life, scanning her cellular structure, identifying the radiation damage, beginning the delicate process of cellular regeneration. It would take time, it would take concentration, but it was possible. It was always possible. The girl's eyes widened as the pain began to fade, as her skin started to knit itself back together at the molecular level. Around them, other workers stopped their prayers, stopped their labors, stared at this impossible thing happening before them. A stranger in strange clothes, holding a glowing stick, performing a miracle that had nothing to do with the Emperor, healing without prayer, medicine without faith, heresy without malice. The whispers started immediately, spread through the hive like a virus. A man who could heal with light, a stranger who asked nothing in return, who spoke of compassion like it was a real thing, not just a word in ancient texts that nobody understood anymore. The Doctor moved through the sectors, unable to stop himself. Every suffering face he passed, every child coughing up blood from lung rot, every worker missing limbs from industrial accidents, every fever, every infection, every preventable death that the Imperium had deemed necessary. He treated them all. He couldn't help it. His nature wouldn't allow anything else. Time Lord biology, regenerative energy, medical knowledge spanning millennia, all of it poured into this one terrible place, trying to push back against an ocean of suffering with his bare hands. That's when the priests noticed. The ecclesiarchy maintained monitoring stations throughout every hive, watching for signs of corruption, deviation, insufficient faith. An old woman reported seeing her grandson walk again after a stranger touched his broken spine. A factory overseer reported workers returning to their stations after fatal exposures, speaking of a blue box and a man with kind eyes. The reports climbed through the hierarchy, reached an inquisitor named Valerius, a man who had burned 17 worlds to save them from corruption, a man who understood that in the Imperium, kindness itself was suspect. True mercy came only from the Emperor. Any other source was either Xenos trickery or warp-spawn deception. There were no other options. There could be no other options. The doctor was treating a family, father, mother, 3 children, all suffering from the same genetic degradation that afflicted 90% of hive-worlders when the enforcers arrived. Black armor, shock malls crackling with electricity. The Arbites, the brutal fist of imperial law in places too worthless for actual military intervention. They surrounded him in seconds, weapons trained on his head, his hearts, his spine. The father he'd been healing threw himself in front of the doctor, arms spread wide. "Please, he saved my daughter. He's a saint, a blessing from the Emperor." The lead enforcer didn't hesitate. One shows. Last bolt through the father's chest. The man crumpled, his daughter screaming, his wife sobbing prayers to a god who wasn't listening. "By order of the Inquisition," the enforcer announced, his voice amplified through his helmet's voxcaster. "You are detained under suspicion of sorcery, heretical healing, and corruption of Imperial citizens through warpcraft." The doctor looked at the dead father, at the family he'd tried to save, at the workers backing away, suddenly afraid to be associated with him, afraid that his kindness would be their death sentence too. He could have escaped. The TARDIS was close. He could have dematerialized, left this place, found somewhere else. But he stayed, allowed the shackles to close around his wrists, because if he ran, they'd punish everyone he'd helped. They'd burn entire sectors to cleanse the taint of his compassion. That's how this empire worked. Collective punishment, shared guilt, 10,000 years of refining cruelty into a science. As they dragged him away, the doctor looked back one last time. The workers had already returned to their labor. The family was being processed, the father's body catalogued for corpse starch, the mother and children reassigned to new work details, their grief noted and dismissed as irrelevant. In 6 hours, it would be as if he'd never been there at all, except for the whispers. The dangerous, heretical whispers that maybe, just maybe, suffering wasn't mandatory. That maybe the Emperor's cruelty wasn't divine wisdom, but just cruelty. That maybe this stranger with his impossible kindness represented something the Imperium had spent 10 millennia trying to erase from human consciousness. The idea that things could be different, that things could be better, that mercy wasn't weakness, but strength. Inquisitor Valerius watched the detention through a picked screen in his orbital station, his augmetic eyes zooming in on the stranger's face. No fear, no anger, just sadness. Deep, ancient sadness, like he'd seen this all before in Athaus. And different forms, and it still hurt just as much. The Inquisitor had seen traitors, heretics, demon-possessed cultists, alien infiltrators. He'd learned to read corruption in the micro-expressions of the guilty. But this man, he read as clean, impossibly clean, which made him more dangerous than any demon, because demons at least made sense. They were predictable. They wanted to corrupt, to destroy, to feast on souls. But a man who genuinely wanted to help, who asked for nothing, who healed without demanding faith, that was something worse. That was something that could make people question, and questions led to doubt, and doubt led to damnation. They brought him to a detention cell deep in the hive's foundation, where the walls wept with condensation and the air tasted like rust and old blood. The doctor sat in silence, hands still bound, listening to the sounds of the Imperium at work. Somewhere above, a shift change was happening. Millions of workers filing in and out of factories that never stopped, never slowed, never acknowledged that the people operating them were alive. Somewhere below, the planetary core reactors hummed with the stolen energy of a sun, burning through fuel rods that would poison this world for 10,000 years after the Imperium moved on. And somewhere in between, in the forgotten spaces where monitoring equipment didn't reach, people whispered about the stranger who had healed with light. He closed his eyes and reached out with his Time Lord senses, feeling the shape of this universe, trying to understand its fundamental architecture. What he found made his blood run cold. Time here was wrong, not broken. He'd seen broken time before, knew how to fix it. This was worse. Time here was infected. The immaterium bled into real space like pus from a wound, and wherever it touched, causality began to rot. Past and future existed simultaneously. Dead things moved, unborn things screamed. The Doctor had traveled through the time vortex for centuries, surfed the flows of temporal energy like breathing, but here the vortex itself was sick, corrupted by something vast and hungry that fed on emotion and shat out nightmares. He opened his eyes and found he wasn't alone anymore. Standing in the corner of his cell, barely visible in the dim red emergency lighting, was a figure that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist. It wore his face, his 9th regeneration, the one forged in the Time War, the one that had learned to be cruel to be kind. But wrong, all wrong. The leather jacket was made of flayed skin. The face smiled with too many teeth. The eyes were windows into a screaming void where sanity went to die. A warp mirror, a reflection of himself twisted by the immaterium, showing him what he could become if this universe had its way. "You feel it, don't you?" the thing said with his voice, his accent, his cadence, all perfect except for the wrongness underneath. The weight of this place, 41,000 years of accumulated suffering, compressed into a psychic scream so loud it echoes backward through time. Every prayer for mercy ignored, every child who died for nothing, every hope that curdled into despair. It's all still here, Doctor, still screaming, still waiting, and now you're here too. Fresh hope, fresh despair. The warp loves that, the warp loves you. The thing stepped closer, and the Doctor could smell it now. Decay and incense, promethium and rotting flowers, the scent of things that were dead but refused to stop moving. The Doctor didn't move, didn't flinch. He'd faced worse. Daleks, Cybermen, the beast itself. But those were enemies he could understand. This was different. This was him. Or could be him. Would be him if he stayed here long enough. "I've seen your past," the warp thing continued, circling him like a predator studying prey. "I've tasted your guilt, the Time War, Gallifrey burning, all those children you killed to save the universe. You thought you'd learn to live with it. But you haven't, have you? You just keep running, keep finding new people to save to make up for the ones you couldn't. But here everyone's already dead. They just haven't stopped working yet." The cell began to change, reality peeling back like skin from muscle. The walls became transparent, and suddenly the Doctor could see through them, through all of them, through every level of the hive simultaneously. He saw workers dying in the reactor chambers, their bodies dissolving into radioactive steam. He saw children being processed into servitors, their brains scooped out and replaced with cogitators, their screams edited out of their memory before they could finish forming. He saw pleasure cults in the underhive, people so desperate for feeling anything other than pain that they carved Slanesh's symbols into their own flesh. He saw it all, every sin, every cruelty, every moment of suffering that the Imperium called necessary. And underneath it all, feeding on it all, the warp pulsed with obscene satisfaction. "You want to save them," the warp mirror whispered, and now there were more of him, his other regenerations, all twisted, all wrong, surrounding him in a circle of corrupted hope. "You always want to save them, but what if they don't want to be saved? What if they've been suffering for so long that suffering is all they understand? What if mercy is just another form of cruelty because it shows them what they can never have?" The voices overlapped, creating a chorus of his own doubt, his own fear, his own terrible knowledge that sometimes, in some places, kindness really was just a lie you told yourself to feel better about walking away. The Doctor took a breath, then another, fighting to stay grounded in himself, in his identity, in the core truth that had survived every regeneration, that compassion mattered even when it didn't work, that trying mattered even when you failed, that the universe was cold and dark and vast beyond comprehension, But inside that darkness were points of light called people, and they deserved better than what they got, and someone had to try. Someone always had to try, even when it was stupid, even when it was hopeless, especially then. He looked at his corrupted reflections, at these warp-born mockeries of everything he'd tried to be, and he smiled. Not a happy smile, not a confident smile, just a tired, sad, defiant smile that said, "I know you're probably right, but I'm going to try anyway." The warp thing screamed. Reality snapped back into place like a rubber band, and the doctor was alone in his cell again, gasping, drenched in cold sweat. But he could still feel them out there, still watching, still waiting, because the Immaterium didn't give up. It couldn't give up. It was made of everything humanity had ever felt and feared and failed to overcome. And now it knew about him, the lonely god who still believed in saving people, the lost. Optimist in a universe that had killed optimism 10,000 years ago. To the warp, he wasn't a threat, he was an opportunity, a chance to corrupt something pure, to prove once and for all that hope itself was just another demon waiting to be born. The Inquisitor came for him at dawn, though dawn was just a concept here. The hive had no natural light, only shift changes marked by different colored warning klaxons. Valerius entered the cell flanked by servo skulls that hummed with recording equipment, documenting every word, every gesture, every micro-expression for later analysis. The doctor looked up at him with those ancient eyes, and for a moment the Inquisitor felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Unease, not fear. Fear was for the weak, but the sensation that he was standing before something older than the Imperium itself. Something that had seen empires rise and fall like seasons changing, and remembered them all with equal sorrow. "You're not human," Valerius stated, not a question, but an accusation refined through centuries of practice. Gene scanners confirm humanoid structure, but with aberrations. 2 hearts, respiratory bypass system, cellular structure that resists aging. You're either Xenos masquerading as human, or you're something worse. A abhuman mutation so severe it should have been purged at birth. He circled slowly, his armor's servos whispering with each step. But the strangest thing, you read clean on every corruption test. No warp taint, no psychic signature, no allegiance to the ruinous powers, just compassion. Genuine, stupid, suicidal compassion. In my experience, that's more dangerous than any plague. The doctor stood, chains clinking. "I'm called the Doctor. I travel, I help where I can, and I've seen a lot of civilizations, Inquisitor. Empires that thought they'd last forever, societies built on cruelty that called it necessity. They all fall eventually. They all collapse under the weight of their own brutality, not because of external enemies, but because you can't build a sustainable future on suffering. It's like building a house on sand made of screaming. Eventually, the foundation dissolves." His voice was gentle, almost conversational, as if they were discussing weather instead of standing in a torture cell. "The Imperium is dying. You know it. Everyone knows it. You're just too terrified to admit it." Valerius's hand moved to his bolt pistol but stopped. The servo skulls whirred, recording his hesitation, and he knew the moment would be reviewed by his superiors. Weakness, doubt, both punishable by death even for an Inquisitor. But the stranger's words had struck something deep, something he'd buried under decades of faith and violence. He'd seen the reports, worlds lost to chaos every day, imperial territories shrinking, forge worlds going silent, chapters falling to corruption, the Astronomicon flickering, the Golden Throne failing, the slow, grinding collapse of an empire that had ruled for 10,000 years. "The Imperium endures," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It endures because it must. Because the alternative is extinction." "Is it though?" the doctor asked softly. "Extinction? Or is extinction just the word you use to justify anything? I've been reading your civilization while sitting in this cell. Your psychic resonance bleeds into everything. Walls, air, even the metal. I can feel the history of this place. And what I've learned is that you've created something worse than extinction. You've created eternal half-life. Humanity suspend. Ed between living and dying, suffering endlessly because someone decided that suffering was the only way to survive. But here's what you don't understand. You're not surviving. You're already dead. You've been dead for 10,000 years. You're just haunting your own corpse." The Inquisitor felt rage building, the kind of rage that came from hearing uncomfortable truth dressed as heresy. But before he could respond, the vox bead in his ear crackled to life. An urgent transmission from the orbital station. A ship had just translated from the warp at the system's edge. Unknown configuration, technology readings that made no sense. Not Imperial, not Chaos, not any Xenos designation in the databases. The Mechanicus adepts were screaming about impossibilities, about dimensional engineering that violated the Omnissiah's sacred principles, and it was heading directly toward them. The Doctor's ship, his TARDIS, responding to his distress like a loyal hound sensing its master in danger. Valerius turned back to his prisoner, and for the first time in his long career serving the Emperor's will, he felt truly uncertain. This stranger with his compassion and his ancient sadness, his impossible ship and his impossible healing, what was he? The question gnawed at Valerius's certainty like acid on ceramite. "You speak of empires falling," the Inquisitor said quietly, dismissing the servo skulls with a gesture. "But you don't understand what we face. The forces arrayed against humanity aren't just armies or aliens. They're gods, actual, literal gods made of our own sin and fear. They whisper in the warp. They corrupt entire worlds with a thought. The Emperor holds them back, but barely. Every day we sacrifice 10,000 psychers just to keep his light burning. Every day we make choices that damn us, but those choices keep humanity alive. So tell me, traveler, what would you do different?" To lie. The Doctor met his gaze, and in that moment Valerius saw something that chilled him more than any daemon he'd ever faced. Pity. This stranger, this prisoner, this impossible man, he pitied them, pitied the Imperium, pitied Valerius himself. "I would have tried talking to them," the Doctor said simply, "before the shooting started, before the wars became eternal, before fear became faith and faith became genocide. I would have tried to understand what those gods wanted, because gods don't spring from nothing. They're born from emotion, yes? From what humanity feels. Then maybe, just maybe, if humanity had felt different things, different gods would have been born. Gods of hope instead of despair, gods of healing instead of plague. But you never tried, did you? You just fought. And the more you fought, the stronger they became, because violence feeds violence, and hate feeds hate, and fear feeds everything." Before Valerius could respond, the world exploded. Not literally, though in the Imperium, literal explosions were common enough to be boring. This was worse. The air cracked like breaking glass, and suddenly the TARDIS was materializing inside the cell. That impossible blue box grinding into existence against every law of physics the Mechanicus held sacred. Klaxons wailed throughout the hive. Defense servitors mobilized, weapons charged. The entire Imperial military machine lurched into action against an enemy it couldn't classify, couldn't understand, couldn't even properly aim at because the targeting systems kept insisting it was simultaneously in multiple locations at once. The Doctor's chains fell away, corroded through by time itself bending around him. He walked to the TARDIS door, paused, looked back at the Inquisitor. "Come with me," he said. And it wasn't a taunt or a challenge, it was a genuine offer. "Let me show you what I've seen. Other civilizations, other solutions. Proof that the way you're living isn't the only way, that mercy isn't weakness, that compassion isn't corruption. You don't have to keep feeding the machine. You don't have to keep sacrificing your humanity to save humanity. There's always another way. There's always—" A bolt round exploded against the TARDIS door, leaving no mark. Valerius had fired without thinking, instinct overriding curiosity, faith overriding doubt. "I can't," Valerius said, and his voice cracked with something that might have been regret. "Even if you're right, even if everything you say is true, I can't, because I've killed too many people for this Imperium. I've burned too many worlds. I've murdered children because their parents were heretics. I've watched good men die for bad reasons and called it necessary. If I admit now that there was another way, then all of that was for nothing. All those deaths, all that suffering, all of it meaningless. I can't carry that weight, Doctor. Better to believe the lie and die faithful than face the truth and die broken." The Doctor looked at him for a long moment, understanding passing between them. Two men on opposite sides of an unbridgeable gap, both carrying guilt too heavy to ever set down. "I'm sorry," the doctor said finally, "for what you've become, for what this universe has made you become." He stepped into the TARDIS, but before the door closed, he added one last thing. "The offer stands. It will always stand. When you're ready to stop running from the truth, I'll be there. Somewhere, somewhen, the blue box in the corner of your nightmares, reminding you that you had a choice." The TARDIS dematerialized with its grinding wheeze, leaving Valerius alone in the cell, bolt pistol still raised, hand trembling. Around him the hive erupted into chaos. Tech priests screaming about dimensional anomalies, astropaths collapsing from psychic feedback, defense systems firing at empty space. And somewhere in the warp, something vast and hungry was laughing because it had tasted what the doctor represented. Pure, undiluted hope in a universe that had forgotten what hope meant. And hope, in the immaterium, was the most delicious flavor of all, the most corruptible, the most doomed. The forge world of Metallicus Prime hung in space like a wounded god, its surface a labyrinth of cathedral factories that stretched from pole to pole, belching radioactive smoke into the void. The Mechanicus had ruled here for 6,000 years, converting the planet's entire biosphere into machinery, replacing flesh with steel, blood with oil, prayer with binary cant. The doctor materialized the TARDIS in the outer districts, where the younger tech priests studied the mysteries of the Omnissiah, the machine god they worshipped with religious fervor that made even the ecclesiarchy look casual. He stepped out into air thick with incense and machine oil, the smell of burning circuits and ancient devotion mixed into something that made his respiratory bypass system activate automatically. They found him within minutes. The Mechanicus didn't tolerate anomalies. Servitor patrols detected his biosignature, unaugmented, uncatalogued, unauthorized. Tech priests converged from every direction, their augmetic limbs clicking and whirring, their organic parts reduced to the bare minimum required for the soul to remain tethered to flesh. They surrounded him in a semicircle of red robes and mechanical certainty, scanning him with every sensor configuration in their arsenals. The lead priest, M. Agos Explorator Zeta 7, tilted his head 45 degrees in the universal Mechanicus gesture of confused calculation. Biological anomaly detected. 2 cardiovascular organs. Cellular regeneration protocols unknown. Technology signature none. Query: are you human? Mostly, the doctor said, offering his most disarming smile. Well, humanoid. Time Lord, technically. But that's just fancy terminology for someone who travels a lot and asks too many questions. Speaking of questions. He gestured at the forge world around them, at the millions of workers half converted to machines, at the tech priests who had replaced so much of themselves that humanity was just a legal technicality. Why do you worship machines? I've seen a lot of religions across time and space, but this is new. You're not just using technology, you're praying to it, you're turning yourselves into it. What are you trying to escape from? What are you trying to become? The Magos' optical sensors focused and refocused, processing the question through logic engines that had been calculating theological mathematics for 3 centuries. Clarification: we do not escape, we ascend. Flesh is weak, flesh fails, flesh corrupts, decays, dies. The Omnissiah teaches that perfection lies in the sacred fusion of biological and mechanical, the motive force given form through blessed steel and sanctified code. We do not fear death, we transcend it. We do not suffer decay, we replace it. Your question implies flesh has value beyond its function as housing for the divine spark. This is incorrect theology. Query: do you deny the weakness of flesh? The doctor thought about that, about his own regenerations, the way he'd cheated death again and again, replacing his body like they replaced their limbs. Not so different really, except he kept the pain, kept the memories, kept the guilt. They were trying to cut all that away. No, he said finally, flesh is weak. Bodies fail, I know that better than most. But weakness isn't the enemy. Weakness is what makes you try harder. Pain is what teaches you compassion. The fear of death is what makes life precious. You're not transcending humanity, you're amputating it. Piece by piece, prayer by prayer, until there's nothing left but calculations pretending to have souls. The Margos stared at him with optical sensors that hadn't blinked in decades. Around them, other tech priests had stopped their work, their auditory processors tuned to this conversation, their logic engines churning through theological implications that their programming said were impossible. Heresy, clear, unarguable heresy, but also, disturbingly, logically consistent. If the goal was to preserve the human soul, but the process destroyed what made humans human, then the equation failed. The Omnissiah's teachings contained a paradox. The Margos felt something stirring in the organic parts of his brain, the tiny percentage of neurons he'd kept to maintain his humanity. Doubt. The first doubt he'd experienced in 300 years. "You speak heresy," Zeta 7 said, but his Voxcaster modulator wavered, creating static that other tech priests recognized as emotional interference, fear, uncertainty, the corruption of clear mechanical faith with organic confusion. The Omnissiah's path is sacred, tested across millennia, proven through the survival of our order when others fell to chaos, xenos, heresy. We endure because we do not yield to weakness. We endure because we transcend. But even as he spoke, his optical sensors were scanning the doctor's biology, marveling at its efficiency, its elegance, its pure function without augmentation. Two hearts working in perfect biological synchronization, respiratory systems that adapted in real time, cellular structures that regenerated without mechanical assistance, natural technology, organic perfection achieved through evolution rather than installation. The doctor stepped closer, lowered his voice. "I've seen your future, not this timeline's future, another one, a place where the Mechanicus achieved everything you're working toward. Complete fusion with machinery, no flesh left at all, just artificial intelligences pretending to be the people they used to be. And you know what happened? They couldn't innovate anymore, couldn't create, couldn't adapt to new problems because adaptation requires the chaos of organic thought, the randomness of neural misfires, the stupid, beautiful mistakes that flesh makes when it's trying to solve impossible problems. They stagnated. And when the universe changed around them, they couldn't change with it. They died, not as martyrs or heroes, just as obsolete machines rusting in the dark. Zeta 7's processing cores screamed with contradiction, logic versus faith, calculation versus dogma, the sacred teaching of the Mechanicus versus the terrifying possibility that they were wrong, that 10,000 years of augmentation and prayer had been leading them not toward transcendence, but toward extinction. His organic brain, that tiny cluster of neurons he'd kept for legal soul retention purposes, was firing signals it hadn't fired in centuries. Questions. Terrible, heretical, human questions about meaning and purpose, and whether surviving as a machine was really survival at all, or just a slower form of death. "Immediate departure required," the Margos said abruptly, his Voxcaster crackling with something that might have been panic. "Your presence generates theological contamination. Logic engines compromised, doctrine subroutines failing, request denied, assistance declined. Remove yourself from sacred ground before I am forced to reclassify you as hostile aberration requiring purge-level response." But he didn't move, didn't signal his servitors to attack, didn't activate the defense protocols that should have already reduced this heretic to component molecules. Because some part of him, some small organic part buried under centuries of metal and dogma, wanted to hear more, wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was another way to be human in this universe of horror. The doctor left the Mechanicus to their crisis of faith, knowing that sometimes the kindest thing you could do was plant a seed of doubt and walk away. Let them wrestle with it. Let them choose their own path. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, across countless civilizations, countless interventions that had gone wrong when he'd pushed too hard, demanded too much, expected people to change overnight. Change took time, even when time was running out, especially then. The TARDIS carried him to the eastern fringe, to a tomb world where the Necrons slept in their billions, waiting for the galaxy to forget them so they could wake and reclaim what they'd lost, or thought they'd lost. The Doctor had always wondered about the Necrons, a species that had traded flesh for immortality and spent 60 million years regretting it. The tomb entrance opened for him without resistance, ancient mechanisms recognizing something in his temporal signature, perhaps mistaking him for one of their long-dead Citan masters, those star gods who had first proposed the terrible bargain. The doctor walked through corridors of living metal that remembered what it was like to breathe, to bleed, to die. He could feel the sorrow in the walls, the crystallized regret of an entire species preserved in necrodermis that could rebuild itself but could never feel warm again. At the heart of the tomb, he found Overlord Zandrek, one of the few Necrons whose engrams still retained something resembling personality, who still believed he was flesh and blood, leading living soldiers instead of undying machines. "Ah, a guest," Zandrek announced in a voice that crackled through a vox grill, his logic circuits so damaged by age that he'd retreated into comfortable delusion. "How wonderful. It's been far too long since we've had proper visitors. Please, sit. I'll have the servants bring refreshments." He gestured to a throne made of black stone, while around him, his immortal guards stood frozen, their combat protocols confused by their lord's hospitality toward an unauthorized intruder. The doctor sat, understanding immediately what had happened here. This Necron had gone mad, but not the violent, dangerous madness the Imperium feared, the sad madness, the kind that built fantasy worlds inside your own skull because reality was too painful to bear. The kind the doctor himself flirted with sometimes in his darkest moments. "Thank you for your hospitality," the doctor said gently. "Tell me, Lord Zandrek, how long have you ruled this world?" The Necron Lord settled into his own throne, his optical sensors glowing with something that might have been warmth if machines could be warm. "Oh, many seasons now. The campaigns have been glorious. We drove back the northern barbarians last winter, lost some good men, of course. Young Oberon took an arrow to the shoulder, but he's recovering well. Tough lad. Reminds me of my own son back when." He paused, and for just a moment, something flickered across his ancient programming, a ghost of memory, the truth trying to surface before being pushed back down by merciful delusion. Back when times were simpler. The doctor leaned forward. "What if I told you that you died 60 million years ago? You and everyone you ever knew. That you traded your flesh and blood for metal bodies that would never age, never sicken, never die, but also never sleep, never dream, never feel the sun on your skin, or taste food, or hold someone you loved and feel their warmth. Would you have made that trade if you'd known what it really meant? Would you have chosen immortality if you'd understood that living forever and being alive weren't the same thing?" The words hung in the air between them, and around the chamber, the immortal guard's optical sensors flickered with something that might have been recognition, might have been horror. Zandrek was silent for a long time. His processors cycled through subroutines, trying to integrate what the doctor had said with his carefully constructed delusion. The truth was there, in his memory banks, in the engrams that had been uploaded from his dying organic brain. He'd agreed to biotransference. He'd watched his flesh burn away. He'd felt his soul compress into cold metal and realized too late what he'd given up. And then he'd spent 60 million years trying to forget, building elaborate fantasies where he was still flesh, still alive, still capable of feeling something other than the cold mathematics of existence. "I don't understand what you mean," he said finally, but his voxcaster trembled. "We're quite alive, all of us, living our lives, fighting our wars, honoring our ancestors." "Are you though?" the doctor asked softly. "Or are you just machines pretending to remember what living felt like, going through the motions, playing at war because war is simple and gives you purpose and keeps you from thinking about what you've become? I'm not judging you, I'm really not. You made a choice in impossible circumstances, facing extinction, offered a way out that seemed like salvation. But it wasn't salvation, was it? It was just a different kind of death, slower, colder, more aware." He stood, walked to one of the immortals, looked up into its optical sensors. "If I could give you flesh again, real blood, real mortality, would you take it? Would you choose to be able to die again if it meant being able to truly live?" The immortal stared down at him, its weapon arm twitching, combat protocols warring with something deeper, something that the biotransference hadn't quite managed to erase. The ghost of a warrior who'd once been a person, who'd once laughed and loved and feared and hoped, now trapped inside a machine that couldn't do any of those things but could still remember that it used to be able to. "We are eternal," it said, its voice flat, emotionless, the words a prayer, or a curse, or both. "We are undying. We are—" It stopped, couldn't finish, because the sentence had no end. They were undying, yes, but they weren't anything else. Just existence without purpose, immortality without meaning, forever without hope of change. Zandrek stood abruptly, his denial shattering like glass. "Leave, please. You've said enough. I don't want to remember. I spent 60 million years forgetting, and you come here with your flesh and your blood and your 2 beating hearts, and you remind me of everything I lost, everyone I lost, my wife, my children, my people, all of them gone, converted, transformed into this." He gestured at himself, at his metal body, at the tomb full of machines pretending to be an army. "I built this delusion because it's better than truth, because truth means accepting that I killed them all, that I agreed to biotransference and doomed billions to this eternal half-life. So please, let me forget again. It's the only mercy left." The doctor walked back to the TARDIS with tears on his face, something that hadn't happened in several regenerations. He'd learned to bury his emotions deeper, to lock away the pain of watching civilizations fail, to keep moving because stopping meant drowning in the weight of all those failures. But the Necrons had broken through. Their tragedy was so vast, so complete, so irreversible that even he couldn't find hope in it. They'd made their choice 60 million years ago, and now they were stuck with it forever, literally forever, conscious and suffering, and unable to even die properly. He'd thought he could help, thought maybe he could offer them something, but what do you offer the undying except the mercy of oblivion? The webway portal shimmered into existence before he reached his ship, reality tearing open like silk to reveal the ancient paths the Eldari used to traverse the galaxy without touching the warp. A figure stepped through, tall, elegant, wrapped in robes that seemed to be made of condensed starlight and sorrow. An Eldari Farseer, her psychic presence washing over him like cold water, reading his timeline, his past, his future, seeing all, the threads of possibility that converged around this strange traveler. Her eyes were older than most human civilizations, filled with the terrible knowledge that came from seeing too much, knowing too much, understanding exactly how and when everything you loved would die. "Doctor," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested she was speaking multiple futures simultaneously, hedging her words across probability. "The skein shows your arrival in this universe as a wound that bleeds across timelines. You are a variable that should not exist, a hope that cannot be allowed to take root. I am Farseer Idranel of Craftworld Ulthway, and I have come to offer you a choice." She gestured, and images appeared in the air between them, futures branching and dying, possibilities collapsing like dying stars. In one, the doctor saved a hive world from plague, and the survivors worshipped him until their worship birthed a minor warp entity of compassion that chaos corrupted within hours. In another, he stopped a war, and the peace lasted 3 days before something worse filled the vacuum. "Every action you take creates ripples," Idranel continued, her tone carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd spent millennia trying to change fate and learning that fate didn't care. "Every person you save creates new futures, new possibilities, new threads in the skein. But this universe has its own momentum, its own trajectory. 10,000 years of accumulated suffering cannot be unwound by one man's kindness. You think you're helping. You think you're making things better, but all you're doing is prolonging the agony, giving people hope just long enough for them to suffer more when that hope is torn away. You're not a healer here, Doctor. You're just making the wound bleed slower." The doctor stared at the futures she was showing him, and he wanted to deny it, wanted to argue, wanted to insist that every life saved mattered even if it didn't change the larger pattern. But he'd seen enough. The hive workers he'd healed, executed for heresy 3 weeks later. The radiation poisoning he'd cured, returned within months because the Imperium didn't fix its reactors, just sent new workers. Every act of kindness he performed was a temporary bandage on a wound that went down to the bone of reality itself. "So what?" he said finally, his voice rough. "I should just give up, let them suffer because saving them is too hard, because the system is too broken to fix?" "No," Idranel said, and her psychic presence flickered with something that might have been sympathy. "I'm saying you should understand what you're fighting. The Imperium isn't just a government or an empire. It's a survival mechanism. Humanity created it because without it, they would have been extinct 10,000 years ago. Yes, it's cruel. Yes, it's brutal. Yes, it grinds up billions of lives like meat in a grinder, but it also keeps the species alive in a galaxy that actively wants them dead. Every alien race, every chaos god, every random cosmic horror drifting through the void, they all want humanity gone, and the Imperium, for all its horror, has kept them at bay." The doctor shook his head. "That's not survival, that's just slow extinction. You're describing a species eating itself to stay alive, a civilization that's become its own predator. And you know what happens to organisms like that? They collapse. They destroy themselves from the inside because the cure becomes worse than the disease. I've seen it happen. I've watched empires last thousands of years, thinking they were eternal, right up until the moment they weren't. The Imperium is dying, everyone knows it. The question isn't if, but when, and whether anything of humanity will be left when it finally falls." Idranel's expression didn't change, but her psychic aura pulsed with resignation. "You're right," she said simply. "The Imperium is dying. Humanity is dying. Our own species is dying. We birth so few children that we're counting down to extinction one soul at a time. The galaxy itself is dying, drowning in the warp's corruption, choking on 10 million years of accumulated violence and fear and hate. Everything dies, Doctor. That's the one universal truth this universe teaches. The only question is how much suffering you endure before the end, and whether you face that end with dignity or desperation." She stepped closer, and he could see the pain in her ancient eyes. "We tried to save our civilization. We had an empire that spanned the galaxy, art, culture, science beyond anything humanity has achieved, and our hedonism, our excess, our inability to recognize our own corruption. It birthed a chaos god, Slaanesh, she who thirsts. And in one moment, in the fall, 60% of our species died screaming as their souls were devoured. The survivors, us, the craft world Aeldari, we live in fear, every day, every moment, knowing that when we die, we don't get peace, we get eaten. Consumed by the god we accidentally created, we wear soul stones around our necks, prisons for our own souls, because oblivion in a stone is better than eternal torture in the warp. That's what hope got us, Doctor. That's what believing we could be better, could transcend, could achieve perfection. It got us a demon god that hungers for our souls. So when you talk about saving people, about showing them there's another way, all I hear is the echo of what we used to believe before we learned the truth. That in this universe, trying to be better just gives you further to fall." The doctor stood in silence, Idranel's words settling over him like ash from a funeral pyre. He'd encountered cynicism before, nihilism, despair dressed up as wisdom. But this was different. This wasn't philosophical debate. This was experiential knowledge. The Aeldari had lived his worst nightmare. They'd tried to build paradise and created hell instead. They'd reached for transcendence and dragged a chaos god screaming into existence. And now they lived in the shadow of their own hubris, paying the price for daring to believe they could be more than what they were. Every word she spoke was carved from millennia of suffering, and he had no counter-argument that didn't sound hollow in the face of that much pain. "I've seen what you're describing," he said finally, his voice quiet. "Civilizations that reached too high and fell too hard. Species that evolved beyond their capacity for wisdom and destroyed themselves in the process. The Time Lords, my own people, we mastered time itself. We could see all of history laid out like a map, past, present, future, all accessible, all controllable. And you know what we did with that power? Nothing. We became observers. Gods who watched the universe suffer and did nothing because we'd calculated that interference caused more harm than good. We became so afraid of making mistakes that we stopped trying to make anything at all." He looked up at the stars, at the galaxy burning with war. I left because I couldn't stand it. Couldn't stand the cowardice of wisdom, the paralysis that comes from knowing too much. Idranel tilted her head, her psychic presence flickering with curiosity. And yet you come here, to a universe even more broken than your own, and you try to help anyway, knowing it's futile, knowing it might make things worse. That's not courage, Doctor. That's compulsion. You're not saving people, you're trying to save yourself. And trying to prove that all the deaths you caused, all the choices you made, all the civilizations you watched burn, that it meant something, that you're still good despite everything. But goodness isn't measured in intentions, it's measured in outcomes, and the outcome of your presence here is suffering multiplied, hope weaponized, compassion turned into corruption. The words hit harder than any weapon because they were true. The Doctor had spent countless regenerations running from that truth, burying it under layers of jokes and charm and manic energy, pretending that helping people was enough, that trying was enough, that good intentions could somehow balance the scales of all his failures. But here, in this universe where intention meant nothing and outcome was everything, where the road to damnation wasn't paved with good intentions, it was built from them, mortared with naive hope and crowned with the screaming souls of those who'd believed things could be different. He felt something crack inside himself, a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. "Then what do I do?" he asked, and the vulnerability in his voice would have shocked anyone who knew him. "If helping makes things worse, if compassion breeds corruption, if every act of kindness feeds the machine I'm trying to fight, what do I do? Give up? Walk away? Let them suffer because saving them is too complicated?" The anger in his voice surprised him. Anger at Idranel for being right, anger at this universe for being wrong, anger at himself for being stupid enough to think one man could make a difference in a galaxy that had spent 10,000 years perfecting despair. "I'm not built to give up. It's not in my nature. Every cell in my body screams at me to help, to heal, to try. You're asking me to cut out my own hearts?" "No," Idranel said gently, and for the first time her voice carried something other than weary resignation. "I'm asking you to understand the difference between helping and saving. You cannot save this galaxy, Doctor. It's too far gone. The rot is too deep. The Chaos Gods are too strong. The Imperium is too entrenched. Trying to save everything means saving nothing. But helping, small moments, individual kindnesses that don't try to change the system but just ease one person's suffering for one moment, that's possible. That's sustainable. That's the only mercy this universe allows." She reached out, not quite touching him, her hand hovering in the space between them. "Be small, be quiet, be forgotten. Help where you can without drawing attention, without inspiring hope that will be turned into ammunition. Be the kindness that doesn't announce itself." The Doctor laughed, bitter and broken. "You're asking me to hide, to skulk in shadows, to be insignificant. I've been fighting insignificance my entire life. I'm supposed to be the man who makes a difference, who changes things, who—" He stopped, heard himself, heard the ego in it, the pride, the same pride that had doomed the Time Lords to irrelevance and the Eldari to damnation. The belief that you could shape the universe to your will if you were just smart enough, strong enough, determined enough. But the universe didn't care about determination. It didn't reward good intentions. It just kept spinning, grinding up civilizations like grain between millstones, and anyone who thought they could stop it was just another piece of grain waiting their turn. Around them, reality began to shift. The warp was stirring, responding to the emotional turmoil pouring off the Doctor like radiation. Idranel stiffened, her psychic senses screaming warnings. "You need to leave," she said urgently. "Now, your despair is feeding something in the Immaterium, something that's been watching you since you arrived. I can see it in the skein, a presence coalescing around your hope, your pain, your desperate need to matter. You're becoming a beacon for corruption you don't understand. Every emotion you feel here is food for demons. Every crisis of faith is an invitation for chaos. You're not equipped for this universe, Doctor. Your compassion is a vulnerability they will exploit." The Doctor felt it too. That presence in the warp, that thing that wore compassion like a mask and fed on the despair of those who tried to help. It was getting stronger, growing, learning his shape, his voice, his memories, a demon of failed salvation. A warp entity born from every good intention that had ever gone wrong, every mercy that had turned to poison, every hero who'd become a monster trying to save the world. It was him and not him. His shadow in a universe where shadows had teeth and hungers and eternities to feed. He stumbled toward the TARDIS, Idrinel's warnings echoing in his mind, the weight of realization crushing down on him like a collapsing star. He'd made a terrible mistake coming here, not because he couldn't help, but because his very presence, his very nature, was fuel for the fire he was trying to extinguish. The Imperium was right to fear him. The Inquisition was right to call him corruption, not because he was evil, but because goodness itself was toxic in a universe that had evolved to weaponize every virtue against itself. He reached the TARDIS doors, looked back one last time at Idrinel. "I'm sorry," he said, "for your species, for what happened to you, for thinking I could do better than you did. I understand now. I understand why you gave up." Idrinel shook her head sadly. "We didn't give up, Doctor. We just learned to grieve while still breathing. There's a difference." The webway portal shimmered, closed behind her, and he was alone again, standing before his blue box, wondering if running away from this universe would be courage or cowardice, and realizing he didn't know anymore. He never made it back inside the TARDIS. Reality tore open before him, not the warp this time, but something cleaner, more precise, more controlled. A golden light that burned with psychic fire so intense it made his Time Lord senses scream. The Custodes materialized around him in a semicircle of auramite armor and guardian spears, their movements too perfect to be human, their silence more threatening than any spoken warning. They didn't speak, didn't negotiate, just surrounded him and activated a teleportation beacon that bypassed every defense the TARDIS could muster. The last thing he saw before the golden light consumed him was his ship, alone and abandoned, waiting for a pilot who might never return. He materialized in the throne room, the heart of the Imperium, the center of humanity's dying dream. The golden throne rose before him like a monument to suffering given form. Machinery and corpse fused together, technology and theology merged into something that was neither alive nor dead but trapped forever in between. And upon it, skeletal and ancient beyond measure, sat the God Emperor of mankind, the being who had guided humanity for 40,000 years, the father who had abandoned his sons and watched them fall to chaos, the tyrant who'd built an empire on lies and called it necessary, the immortal who was dying by inches, sustained only by the sacrifice of 10,000 psychers every single day. Their souls burned like fuel to keep his withered carcass conscious enough to hold back the warp. The psychic pressure was overwhelming. The Doctor fell to his knees not from reverence but from the sheer weight of the Emperor's presence, a mind so vast it could oversee 1,000,000 worlds simultaneously, so powerful it held back literal gods through force of will alone, so old it remembered when humanity still had hope. The Emperor's voice didn't speak aloud. It manifested directly in the Doctor's consciousness, bypassing language entirely, communicating in pure meaning that his Time Lord brain struggled to process. Another immortal, another who refuses to die, another who travels time and thinks himself wise because he has seen much. "I know your kind, Doctor. I was your kind once." The Doctor managed to look up, meeting what passed for the Emperor's gaze, twin points of golden fire in a skull that had been human once, so long ago that the definition of human had changed in the interim. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper against the psychic hurricane. "You were supposed to be humanity's protector, their guide, their hope, and instead you became their prison warden, their slave master. You built an empire that eats its own children and called it salvation. What happened?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, just a moment, the psychic pressure lessened, as if the Emperor himself was considering how to answer a question he'd probably been asking himself for 10,000 years. "I tried your way." The Emperor's presence thundered through the Doctor's mind, and suddenly he was seeing visions, memories pulled from the Emperor's eternal consciousness. A man who'd walked the earth during humanity's early days, guiding them gently, helping from the shadows, believing that humanity needed to grow at its own pace, make its own mistakes, find its own path to enlightenment. The Doctor saw him as a teacher, a philosopher, a quiet hand nudging civilization toward peace. Saw him try compassion, try patience, try hope. And humanity nearly went extinct. They worshipped gods that devoured them. They built empires that cannibalized themselves. They created artificial intelligence that rebelled and nearly ended them. They reached for the stars and found only things that wanted them dead. More visions flooded through. The age of strife. Humanity scattered across the galaxy, isolated, degenerating, dying by the billions while the warp storms raged. The Emperor watching from terror, seeing his species, his children, suffering because he'd been too gentle, too patient, too kind. Seeing them worship chaos because they'd never been taught better. Watching them enslave each other because he'd believed they could learn cooperation on their own. And finally, the terrible choice. Stay hidden and let humanity die, or reveal himself and save them through force, through cruelty, through the only language the universe seemed to understand, absolute, unwavering, merciless control. I chose survival over virtue. I chose life over freedom. I built an imperium of suffering because the alternative was extinction, and every single day for 10,000 years I have lived with that choice. The doctor felt tears streaming down his face, understanding now why the Emperor's presence carried such weight. It wasn't just power, it was guilt. Infinite, eternal guilt compressed into a consciousness that couldn't forget, couldn't sleep, couldn't escape the knowledge of every atrocity committed in his name. The Emperor was trapped in his own empire, a prisoner of the system he'd created, dying by inches, but unable to die completely, because if he did, the Astronomicon would fail and humanity would be lost in darkness. He was doing exactly what the Doctor was trying to do, saving people at any cost, but he'd been doing it for 40,000 years and it had turned him into a monster. A necessary monster perhaps, but a monster nonetheless. You could have done better, the Doctor said, knowing even as he spoke that the words were hollow. You had the power, the knowledge, the time. You could have taught them instead of enslaving them, could have shown them why chaos was dangerous instead of just demanding blind faith. Could have built an empire of citizens instead of subjects. Could have. He stopped because the Emperor's psychic presence was laughing, a sound like breaking glass and dying stars. Could have, should have, the refuge of those who have never held responsibility for billions of lives. Tell me, Time Lord, how many civilizations have you saved? How many times have you intervened, fixed the immediate problem, then left before the consequences manifested? You flee before your kindness turns to poison. You escape before your hope births demons. I don't have that luxury. I must stay. I must endure. I must watch every act of mercy become a weakness exploited by chaos. The Emperor leaned forward, and the Doctor could see the pain in that gesture, the effort it took for a corpse to move even slightly. You want to save humanity, truly save them, then sit on this throne, take my place, spend 10,000 years making impossible choices, watching worlds burn because saving them would cost 100 more, sacrificing billions to preserve trillions, crushing hope because hope in this universe gives birth to demons. Do that, Doctor. Prove that your compassion can survive the weight of reality. Prove that your gentle methods work against gods who feed on gentleness itself. The challenge hung in the psychic space between them, and the Doctor realized with horrible clarity that he couldn't answer it. Couldn't imagine sitting here for 10 millennia, making those choices, becoming what the Emperor had become. Around them the warp began to pulse. The presence that had been following the Doctor, feeding on his hope and despair, was growing stronger. It had followed him here, to the very heart of the Imperium, drawn by the psychic resonance of two immortals confronting each other with the weight of their failures. The Emperor felt it too, his consciousness focusing on this new threat like a weapon being aimed. There, do you see it? That is what your compassion has birthed, a demon of failed salvation, a warp entity that feeds on the despair of those who try to help and fail. You've been here less than a month and already you're spawning chaos. Imagine what you'd create in 10,000 years. The presence pressed closer, and the Doctor could feel it now. His own voice, his own memories, his own failures given teeth and hunger, waiting to consume him. The demon manifested fully, tearing through reality like paper. It wore the doctor's face, all of his faces, his regenerations layered over each other like a nightmare reflection, each one twisted by warp corruption. It spoke with his voice but amplified through the screams of everyone he'd failed to save across all of time and space. Every civilization that had fallen after he'd left, every person who died because his help came too late or went wrong, every companion he'd lost, every choice he'd regretted, all of it compressed into a single entity of pure, concentrated guilt given malevolent consciousness. "I am what you are," it said, and its voice was almost gentle, almost kind. "The mirror you refuse to look into, the truth you keep running from. You don't save people, Doctor. You postpone their suffering. You give them hope just long enough to make the inevitable fall hurt more." The Doctor stood between the demon and the Emperor, feeling the psychic pressure from both sides threatening to crush him. He could run. The T. Ardis was still waiting. He could dematerialize, flee to another universe, another time, leave this nightmare behind and pretend it had never happened. He'd done it before. Run from consequences, escaped before his mistakes caught up with him. But something held him in place, not courage. He'd lost his certainty in his own courage, somewhere between the Necron tomb and the Golden Throne. Not duty. He owed this universe nothing, and it had made clear he wasn't wanted here. Just stubborn, stupid, impossible refusal to let the darkness win without at least trying one more time, even when trying was hopeless, especially then. "You're right," he said to the demon, to himself, to the Emperor, to everyone who'd ever told him his compassion was just arrogance in disguise. "I fail, constantly, spectacularly. I've lost more people than I've saved. I've made mistakes that killed civilizations. I've been wrong so many times I've lost count. But I keep trying anyway, because the alternative is accepting that cruelty is inevitable, that suffering is necessary, that the universe is cold and dark and meaningless, and we're all just atoms bouncing around until entropy wins. I can't accept that. I won't. Even if it makes me a fool, even if it makes me dangerous, even if it births demons that wear my face and mock me with my own failures." He turned to the Emperor, his voice strengthening. "You asked what I would do differently. Here's my answer. I would fail better. I would make mistakes with compassion instead of certainty. I would break, trying to be kind instead of succeeding by being cruel." The demon lunged, and the Doctor didn't run, didn't dodge, didn't defend himself. He opened his arms and embraced it, this corruption born from his own hope, this manifestation of every reason he should give up. And as its claws tore into him, as its poison flooded through his system, as it tried to consume him from the inside out, he did something the demon didn't expect. He forgave it, forgave himself, forgave every failure, every loss, every moment of weakness. Not because those failures didn't matter, but because guilt without forgiveness was just another form of cruelty, and he'd seen enough cruelty for several lifetimes. The demon screamed as forgiveness burned through it like acid, because demons were made of negative emotion, and genuine self-compassion was poison to them. It thrashed, trying to escape, but the Doctor held tight. "I forgive you," he whispered. And he wasn't sure if he was talking to the demon, or himself, or the entire universe that had created this impossible situation. "I forgive you for being born from my pain. I forgive myself for not being able to save everyone. I forgive this galaxy for being broken beyond my capacity to fix. I forgive the Emperor for making impossible choices. I forgive the Imperium for surviving the only way it knows how. I forgive the Chaos Gods for being born from humanity's worst impulses. I forgive it all, not because it's okay, not because it doesn't hurt, but because hatred and guilt and blame, they're just fuel for the fire, and I won't feed it anymore." The demon dissolved, not destroyed but unmade, its essence scattering back into the warp like smoke in wind, but the cost was steep. The Doctor felt his current regeneration burning away, consumed by the psychic feedback of embracing a warp entity directly. Golden light erupted from his body as regeneration energy flooded through him, but wrong, corrupted by T. He warp's touch, unstable. The Emperor's consciousness pressed against him, and for a moment they were connected, two immortals sharing the weight of eternal responsibility. The Doctor felt 10,000 years of suffering compressed into a single instant. felt every world the Emperor had burned to save 100 more, felt every child sacrificed to keep the species alive, felt the endless grinding necessity of choices that had no good options, only varying degrees of terrible. And underneath it all, buried so deep it was almost invisible, he felt something that shocked him. Hope. The Emperor's hope. Tiny, fragile, nearly dead, but still there, still refusing to fully extinguish despite 40,000 years of reasons to give up. "You are a fool," the Emperor's presence said, but there was something different in the psychic tone now. Not warmth. The Emperor had forgotten warmth millennia ago, but perhaps respect, recognition, the acknowledgement of one broken idealist to another. But perhaps the galaxy needs fools. Perhaps it needs someone stupid enough to keep trying when wisdom demands surrender. Go. Take your blue box and leave this universe. You cannot save it. But perhaps, somewhere, somewhen, you can save someone, and perhaps that someone will save another. And perhaps after enough small kindnesses ripple through eternity, something better might emerge from the ashes of everything I've built. It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't endorsement, just tired acknowledgement that different approaches might work for different scales, that the Emperor's macro-level brutality and the Doctor's micro-level compassion weren't necessarily contradictory, just operating at different frequencies. The Custodes materialized again, but this time they didn't surround him. They opened a path, an exit, permission to leave. The Doctor stumbled toward it, his regeneration still flickering unsteady. Ably, his Time Lord biology struggling to process the warp corruption it had absorbed. He looked back one last time at the Emperor, at that skeletal figure trapped on a golden throne, dying for 10,000 years and unable to die completely. "I'm sorry," he said, "for judging you before understanding, for thinking it was simple, for believing I could fix in weeks what you've been struggling with for millennia. You're right, I'm a fool, but..." He smiled weakly, that impossible smile that had survived every regeneration. "At least I'm a fool who still believes tomorrow might be different." The golden light consumed him, and he materialized back beside the TARDIS. The ship was humming, worried, having felt his pain through their psychic connection. He collapsed against the doors, his regeneration finally stabilizing, but leaving him changed. Not physically, not yet, but internally. He'd come to this universe thinking he could save it. Instead, it had saved him from his own naive certainty, had shown him that compassion without wisdom was just another form of violence, that hope without understanding was just another demon waiting to be born. He pulled himself inside the TARDIS, set coordinates for anywhere else, any other universe where the rules made more sense and kindness didn't automatically curdle into corruption. But he knew he'd never forget this place, would never forget the Inquisitor who'd chosen comfortable lies over terrible truths. The Necrons trapped in eternal half-life, the Mechanicus amputating their humanity to survive, the Aeldari living in the shadow of their own hubris, the Emperor dying slowly to keep his species alive, and all those billions of people suffering in hives and factories and battlefields, living brutal short lives because the alternative was extinction. The TARDIS dematerialized, pulling away from that universe of eternal war, carrying its pilot back toward realities where his methods might actually help instead of harm. The Doctor sat at the console, both hearts beating steadily, and whispered a prayer to gods he didn't believe in, that someday, somehow, when the Imperium finally fell and humanity was forced to rebuild, they would remember that there had once been another way, that kindness had existed, that someone had tried. In the warp, the echo of his presence slowly faded, the corruption he'd accidentally spawned dispersing back into the Immaterium's chaos. But something remained. Not a demon, not a god, just a whisper, a memory, the faintest possible impression of someone who'd come to hell and refused to stop being kind even when kindness was heresy. The workers in the hive where he'd first landed, they whispered about him in the darkness between shifts. The man with the blue box who'd healed without asking for worship. The stranger who'd smiled at suffering and called it unacceptable. The story spread like a virus, mutating as it traveled, becoming legend, becoming myth, becoming heresy. and somewhere in the grinding machinery of the Imperium, in the spaces between surveillance and control, people started asking dangerous questions. What if things could be different? What if suffering wasn't necessary? What if there was another way? The questions were small, powerless, doomed to be crushed by the same system they questioned. But they existed, and existence, in a universe built on eternal stagnation, was its own form of rebellion. The Doctor was gone, but the idea of him remained, and ideas, as the Imperium had learned over 10,000 years, were harder to kill than demons. In the tech temples of the Mechanicus, a young adept named Zeta-7 began researching biological augmentation instead of replacement, wondering if flesh and machine could coexist rather than compete. On a tomb world, an immortal guard stood watch with slightly different subroutines, its combat protocols modified, eyed by a ghost of memory that said perhaps eternal existence without purpose was the real curse, not mortality itself. On Craftworld Ulthwé, Farseer Idranel looked into the skein and saw the tiniest probability shift, a future where the galaxy didn't burn quite as bright, where suffering decreased by an infinitesimal fraction, where one small act of kindness, repeated across eons, might compound into something resembling hope. It wasn't salvation, wasn't redemption, just the mathematical possibility that entropy could be delayed, that darkness could be held back one candle at a time, that the heat death of compassion itself might take a few extra millennia to complete. She smiled, for the first time in centuries, and the smile was sad but genuine. The fool had failed, yes, but he'd failed beautifully, and in a universe where beautiful failures were indistinguishable from miracles, perhaps that was enough. And in the throne room, on Holy Terra, the God Emperor of mankind sat upon his golden throne and felt something he hadn't felt in 10,000 years. Not hope. Hope was a luxury for the living, and he was neither alive nor truly dead. But possibility, the faintest psychic echo of a man who'd embraced his own demon and survived, who'd chosen forgiveness over vengeance, who'd walked through hell wearing kindness like armor and emerged scarred but unbroken. The Emperor's consciousness expanded across the Imperium, touching 1 billion astropaths, whispering through 1 trillion prayers, and for just one moment, one impossible, heretical, beautiful moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe the Doctor was right, that maybe there was another way, that maybe, after all this time, all this suffering, all these millennia of darkness, the galaxy could still remember what it meant to be gentle. The moment passed. Reality reasserted itself. The Astronomicon burned. The Psychers screamed. The wars continued. The Imperium ground onward like it always had, like it always would, until the heat death of the universe or its own collapse, whichever came first. But somewhere in the vast psychic architecture of the Emperor's consciousness, in a place so deep and so quiet that even the Chaos Gods couldn't hear it, a small flame flickered. Not hope, not quite. Just the memory of someone who'd still believed in hope when hope was heresy. Just the echo of a fool who'd tried anyway. Just the ghost of a blue box and a man with 2 hearts who'd looked at the worst the galaxy could offer and said, simply, stubbornly, impossibly, "No, you can be better." It wasn't enough to save the Imperium, wasn't enough to heal the warp, wasn't enough to bring back the dead or undo 10,000 years of accumulated trauma. But it was something. A seed planted in poisoned soil, a spark in the darkness, a reminder that once, just once, someone had cared enough to try. And in a universe where trying was the most dangerous thing you could do, where caring was the fastest path to corruption, where compassion itself was just another word for weakness waiting to be exploited, that simple, stupid, beautiful act of trying mattered more than all the wisdom in the galaxy. The Doctor was gone, but the idea of the Doctor remained, and ideas, as the Imperium had learned over 10,000 years, were the most dangerous weapons of all. Because ideas didn't die, they multiplied. They evolved, they spread like wildfire through the cracks in reality, finding purchase in hearts that had forgotten how to hope, taking root in minds that had been taught that questioning was death. The Imperium could burn heretics, could purge planets, could execute billions in the name of compliance, but it couldn't kill an idea, not completely, not forever, Not when that idea was as simple and as dangerous as this, that maybe, just maybe, somewhere in this galaxy of endless war, there was still room for kindness, that maybe suffering wasn't mandatory, that maybe cruelty wasn't the only survival mechanism, that maybe, just maybe, there was another way. The Doctor had entered Warhammer 40,000. He had failed to save it, failed to change it, failed to make a difference that would last longer than a single heartbeat in the grand sweep of galactic time. But he had tried. And in a universe built on the corpses of people who'd stopped trying, who'd given up, who'd accepted that darkness was inevitable and hope was heresy, that act of trying, that refusal to surrender, that stubborn, stupid, impossible belief that tomorrow could be different than today, that was its own form of victory. Not a grand victory, not a triumphant victory, just a small, quiet, personal victory that said, I was here, I cared, I tried, and maybe, somewhere, somewhen, that will matter to someone. In the end, that was all anyone could do. Try, fail, try again, fail better, keep the flame alive one more day, hold back the darkness one more hour, save one more person, even knowing they'd die eventually. Everyone died eventually, but at least they'd die knowing someone had cared enough to try. The Doctor understood that now, not intellectually. He'd always understood it intellectually, but deep in his bones, in his two hearts, in the very fabric of his being. He understood that salvation wasn't about winning, it was about refusing to quit. And in that understanding, in that acceptance of his own limitations and the universe's infinite capacity for cruelty, he found something he'd been searching for across countless regenerations and infinite lifetimes. Not peace, not redemption, not forgiveness. Just the quiet certainty that trying mattered, even when it didn't work, especially then. The TARDIS drifted through the void between universes, carrying its pilot toward new adventures, new civilizations, new people to save, and new failures to mourn. Behind it, the Warhammer 40,000 universe continued its slow collapse, its inevitable slide toward either transformate, iron, or extinction. The Doctor had come and gone, a brief anomaly in 40,000 years of history, barely worth remembering except by those who'd seen him, who'd been touched by him, who'd been changed by the simple act of witnessing someone who still believed that compassion mattered. And in a galaxy where belief shaped reality, where faith could birth gods and hope could spawn demons, perhaps that belief, that simple, dangerous belief that kindness still mattered, was the most powerful weapon of all. Not powerful enough to save the galaxy, but powerful enough to save one person, and then another, and then another, until perhaps after enough small salvations, after enough tiny acts of defiance against the darkness, something better might emerge from the ashes of what came before. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the Imperium would fall and humanity would die, and the warp would consume everything, and all that trying, all that caring, all that stupid, beautiful hope would amount to nothing in the end. But that was the gamble, wasn't it? That was the choice. To try anyway, to care anyway, to hope anyway, knowing it might birth demons, knowing it might make things worse, knowing it would almost certainly fail, but trying anyway. Because the alternative, accepting that darkness had already won, that cruelty was inevitable, that suffering was necessary, that alternative was worse than any demon. That alternative was the death of everything that made life worth living. And the Doctor, for all his failures, for all his losses, for all his 10,000 mistakes across time and space, he refused to accept that alternative. He would keep trying, keep failing, keep getting back up and trying again, until the universe ran out of time or he ran out of regenerations, whichever came first. Because that's what the Doctor did. That's what he'd always done. That's what he would always do. No matter how hopeless, no matter how futile, no matter how stupid and dangerous and doomed it was, he tried. And in a universe of eternal war, that simple act of trying was the most radical thing,